Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and you may be thinking, "Hey, I thought this was Monday, and isn't it supposed to be time for the live stream with Peter and George?" Yes, normally that would have been the case. However, Peter has been unwell. He's had a surgery performed on his eye in the hospital. He's doing fine. He'll be discharged tomorrow morning, and so he'll be up and running in the next day or so. So nothing to worry about. So you have to then put up with me for a little bit longer. Anyway, I want to do a short podcast on the latest developments on Ukraine, the ceasefire, peace talks, whatever. And today, this is Monday, President Putin announced that Russia will order a unilateral 3-day ceasefire. So here is the announcement from the Kremlin. And here you can see that says the decision of the president this is the it's to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. So it'll be 3 days. So it'll be May the 8th, May the 9th, and May the 10th. A unilateral ceasefire from Russia, but in the expectation or hope or whatever that Ukraine will respond and also order a ceasefire. If not, then there'll be no ceasefire. So here we have Putin saying, for humanitarian reasons, during the days of the 80th anniversary of the victory, from midnight on May the 7th and 8th until midnight on May the 10th and 11th, the Russian side declares a ceasefire. All military actions are suspended for this period. And then Russia believes that the Ukrainian side should follow this example. In case of ceasefire violations by the Ukrainian side, the Russian armed forces will provide an adequate and effective response. The Russian side once again declares its readiness for peace negotiations without preconditions, aimed at eliminating the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and constructive interaction with international partners. So again, this is the formulation that the Russians are going with, which is eliminating the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. And until you do that, basically there are going to be no ceasefires other than these special ceasefires like the one that they had, the 30-hour ceasefire over Easter, and now this 3-day ceasefire to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazism. But that's all that. So, but the original American proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, that's not doable unless they're willing to engage in negotiations aimed at eliminating the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. So that was that's the announcement today. And over the weekend, we had an interview. We'd already played excerpts, brief excerpts from that interview that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had on Face the Nation, and the interview, it's quite a lengthy interview, was quite interesting. Not in the sense that anything new emerged from it, but how Lavrov answered the obviously very hostile questioning from the CBS anchor. So let's just take a look at briefly at that interview, and here we have that. We could listen to her, and here it is.
So just to be clear, when the President of the United States says, Vladimir, stop, is this a rejection of that request? Was the assessment that because of what you say regarding the concerns that this loss of civilian life made it worth it?
Well, I can assure you that the target attacked was not something absolutely civilian like a TV center in Belgrade in 1999. This was an intentional attack against civilian target. In our case, we only target those sites which are used by the military. And regarding...
It's very interesting that he brings up the attack on the RTS studio in April 1999, because that was, of course, an entirely civilian attack, which NATO boasted about at the time. This was, hey, we're attacking Milosevic's propaganda machine. But of course, that doesn't get you off the hook, because it's still, whether it's a propaganda machine or it's not a propaganda machine, it's still a civilian target. You know, you may not like them, you may not call them journalists or media or whatever. Nonetheless, it's clearly a civilian target. And so NATO then did a quick scramble in subsequent days and suggested that somehow this RTS studio, which was entirely civilian studio, was integrated within Belgrade's military communications infrastructure. And so so it was a legitimate military target. We killed a whole bunch of makeup girls and technicians and cameramen, but they were all really integrated within the Serbia's military infrastructure. So it's very interesting that Lavrov brings this up.
The ceasefire and regarding the call to stop, President Putin immediately supported President Trump's proposal a few weeks ago to establish a 30-day ceasefire, provided we do not repeat mistakes of the last 10 years, when deals were signed and then Ukraine would violate those deals with the support and with encouragement from Biden administration and from European countries. This was the fate of the deal of February 2014. Then this was the fate of the Minsk agreements. And this was the fate of the deal reached on the basis of Ukrainian proposals in Istanbul in April 2022. So President Putin said, ceasefire, yes, but we want the guarantees that the ceasefire would not be used again to beef up Ukrainian military, and that the supplies of arms should stop.
Ukraine accepted on March 11th that idea of a U.S. brokered ceasefire without preconditions. You're saying the preconditions are a negotiation to end something else?
No, it is not a precondition. It is the lessons learned after at least 3 times. The deals similar to the one which we are discussing now were broken by the Ukrainian regime with a strong support from European capitals and Biden administration. If you want a ceasefire just to continue supply arms to Ukraine, so what is your purpose? Right. You know what Kaja Kallas and what's his name, Mark Rutte said about the ceasefire, the NATO and the Secretary General and the European Union. They bluntly stated that they can support only the deal which at the end of the day will make Ukraine stronger, would make Ukraine a victor. So if this is the purpose of the ceasefire, I don't think this is what President Trump wants. This is what Europeans, together with Zelensky, want to make out of President Trump's initiative.
Will Russia continue targeting Kyiv despite President Trump saying, Vladimir, stop?
You're not listening to me. We will continue to target.
Because it's exasperating. It's like, you listen to this, And Lavrov explains that we are not targeting civilian targets. If they're being used by the military, then they essentially are military targets, even though there may be civilians there. And then she goes on, she says, will you go on targeting civilians? And so it says, you're not listening. And that's so typical whenever Western journalists start interviewing Russian leaders, that they go in there with these talking points, and then they just keep repeating these talking points and try to play this whole gotcha game on fact checking and so on. And so the conversation does very quickly become quite pointless. I mean, you've got Lavrov here for something like 45 minutes. Try to make the best of those 45 minutes, just over and over again asking the same question isn't going to help anyone.
Sites used by the military of Ukraine, by some mercenaries from foreign countries, and by instructors whom the Europeans officially sent to help target Russian civilian sites. If you take a look at the situation in the Kursk region of Russia, for example, there is no single military target for the last 6 months which the Ukrainians would fire at. And there was also a proposal by President Trump, immediately supported by President Putin, to have a 1 month moratorium on the attacks on energy infrastructure. We never violated this commitment of President Putin, and Ukrainians violated what Zelensky seemed to support several hundred times. And I sent to Marco Rubio and to the United Nations the list of those attacks. It's really very, very telling and eloquent.
And Ukraine disputes that, but putting that aside, I want to ask you about what President Trump said on Wednesday. The president of the United States says he thinks the U.S. and Russia have a deal. Let's get it done. Does President Putin agree?
Well, the president of the United States believes, and I think rightly so, that we are moving in the right direction. The statement by the president mentions a deal, and we are ready to reach a deal, but there are still some specific points, elements of this deal which need to be fine-tuned, and we are busy with this exact process. And the president of the United States did not spell out the elements of the deal, so it is not appropriate for me to do this.
But he did say there was a deal and that he was sending his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to meet with Vladimir Putin Friday in Russia. Is that meeting still happening? And should we expect a deal this week?
Well, you don't trust the word of the president of the United States?
I was asking your president's word. What will he tell the U.S. envoy?
We continue our contacts with the American side on the situation in Ukraine. There are several signs that we are moving in the right direction. First of all, because President Trump is probably the only leader on earth who recognized the need to address the root causes of this situation. When he said that it was a huge mistake to pull Ukraine into NATO, and this was a mistake by Biden administration, and he wants to rectify this. And Marco Rubio expressed yesterday, I think, also the assessment that the American team now is getting a better understanding of the Russian position and of the root causes of this situation. One of these root causes, apart from NATO and creation of direct military threats to Russia just on our borders, another one is the rights of the national minorities in Ukraine. Everything Russian, media, education, culture, anything was prohibited by law in Ukraine. And to get out of this crisis, you cannot just forget about human rights. Whenever we discuss Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, anything, American negotiators put on top human.
No, it's not illegal to speak Russian. She's missing the point, but that the fact is that there is repression against Russian culture there, and in fact, it is illegal to speak Russian. I mean, if you start speaking in Russian in Kiev, you could absolutely be fined. All this has been recorded. All of the measures taken against Russian language media, all of the steps taken against Russian language education, and against if you go into a department store and then open and start speaking in Russian, you are going to be in a lot of trouble. And then this ridiculous CBS anchor, starts getting into an argument, doing the fact check of Lavrov. Oh, it's not illegal to speak Russian. I mean, even if true, that's the best you've got. It's not illegal to speak Russian, even though that isn't true.
Right. They have claims in this regard to China, to us, to anybody. But whenever Europeans and other Western nations speak about Ukraine, nobody can mumble the words human rights. Just nobody. On the contrary, what Ursula von der Leyen and other people in Brussels and in Europe say, that Ukraine is defending the European values. So one of these values is canceling the Russian language. Imagine if Israel canceled. Imagine if Israel canceled Arabic language.
The president of Ukraine speaks Russian. When does he speak Russian? I mean, what a ridiculous, idiotic thing for her to say. It is not illegal to speak Russian. She has no idea, absolutely no idea what happens in the Ukraine. She's getting into an argument with a Russian foreign minister. This is this typical sort of arrogance, that well, it's not illegal to speak Russian.
In Palestine. Just imagine.
Yeah. You mentioned that the U.S. and Russia need to work on some of these fine points of a deal.
Yeah, you want the fine points to be spelled out?
Well, of course, I'd love that, but my question was, European sources say that the U.S. proposal is really just kind of a list of bullet points. Does Russia have details, the details you need at this point in terms of a formal proposal?
We are really polite people, and unlike some others, we never discuss in public what is being discussed in negotiations. Otherwise, negotiations are not serious. To ask for somebody's opinion regarding the substance, go to Zelensky. He is happy to talk to anybody through media, even to President Trump. He presents his claims. We
he said
are serious. We are serious people,
so
and we consider serious proposals. We make serious proposals, and this is a process which is not supposed to be public until the end of it.
Okay, so no deal is imminent.
I didn't say this. Now I understand, by the way, why you wanted to get brief answers to your questions. You want some slogans to be in the
No, the president of the United States said there was a deal with Russia, so I wanted to ask Russia if there is a deal with the United States.
Well,
I just want to be clear.
We made our comments on this statement. The negotiations continue, and until the end of the negotiations, we cannot disclose what it is about.
Okay. The National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, said last month that President Trump is asking for thousands of Ukrainian children who were taken in.
So I mean, this is a lengthy interview. I'll post it on the locals page. But again, you can see how what an absurd figure this CBS anchor is, asking a ridiculous question. But anyway, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who seems to be absent from the action, he gave an interview on Sunday to meet the press, and he again repeated what he had said before, that, well, we need to see some action. We need to move towards something. But nonetheless, he was quite interesting in revealing the Trump's thinking.
But we're not close enough.
Let's talk about what we've heard from and seen from President Trump online, who now says he wants to deal with President Putin, quote, differently through banking or secondary sanctions. Will President Trump follow through with?
Now, remember, this is when Trump sent this truth out after his meeting with Zelensky on Saturday in St. Peter's Basilica, in which, after ranting against the New York Times, he said, well, maybe, Putin is stringing me along, and that he's not serious about peace. So maybe, we can start thinking about sanctions, secondary sanctions, which means sanctions against third countries who are doing business with Russia. And that's something that had been mooted by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Right.
Posing new sanctions against Russia?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to, the president, we have multiple options, frankly, to address this and to deal with all of this, but we don't want to get to that point. This is still not the time. I think what the president is saying and has been saying for some time now is he is aware that he has these options. People ask him about it all the time, but what he really wants is a peace deal. He wants the dying and the killing to stop. This is a terrible war. It's cost the lives of thousands of people, billions of dollars, and generational destruction on the side, especially on the Ukrainian side. We want the war to end. You saw yesterday at the Pope's Mass, there was talk about war and how it needed to stop. The Pope, the late Pope, who's celebrated for being a peacemaker and trying to talk about these things. We should all be happy that we have a president of the United States and Donald J. Trump who wants to end and prevent wars. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so ultimately, look, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't come to fruition, then as a nation state, there are options that we have for those who we hold responsible for not wanting the peace. But we'd prefer not to get to that stage yet because we think it closes the door to diplomacy.
Well, the president has made a number of demands against Ukraine. Just last month, the president told me he might impose penalties against Russia. I guess given the frustrations that he is voicing, Mr. Secretary, why hasn't he imposed sanctions yet?
Well, because I think we're still hoping to see that this effort works out in diplomacy and that we can bring these two sides closer together. I mean, the minute you start doing that kind of stuff, you're walking away from it. You've now doomed yourself to another 2 years of war, and we don't want to see it happen. I think what's important and really weighs is there is no other country, there is no other institution or organization on the earth that can bring these two sides together. No one else is talking to both sides but us. And no one else in the world can make something like this happen but the president. This is a very significant responsibility and a really important opportunity. And we want to make sure that we work it all the way through, that we don't walk away from something that can actually work or that can actually lead to peace. But we also don't want to continue to spend time on something that's not going to get us there. So throughout this process, it's about determining, do both sides really want peace? And how close are they or how far apart they are after 90 days of effort here, over 90 days of effort. That's what we're trying to determine this week. There are reasons to be optimistic, and there are also reasons to be concerned. It's complicated. If this was an easy war to end, it would have been ended by someone else a long time ago. But right now, the only one who can bring these two sides together to end this war is our president, President Trump.
So here, again, you can see how this time it's NBC who takes the view that takes the view that, of course, it's all a matter of imposing sanctions on Russia, and somehow that's the way we're gonna get anywhere. Now, interestingly enough, Lavrov also gave an interview with a Brazilian newspaper, and here he's being quite explicit in Russia's conditions. which he didn't spell out in that the interview with Face the Nation. And here this is with his Brazilian newspaper O Globo, and he says, on what terms would Russia agree to come to the negotiation table with Ukraine at this point? And then Lavrov says it was Kiev which withdrew from the negotiating process in April 2022. It acted in this way at the request of its Western curators. In September of the same year, Vladimir Zelensky outlawed all talks with Russia. This piece of legislation remains in force. It must be cancelled, otherwise talks cannot resume. In his recent interview with CBS, Zelensky once again spoke out against talks with Russia. Let me quote his words: "We can't trust Russia. It's that we can't trust negotiations with Russia. And then we have made no secret regarding our position on the settlement. Russia proceeds from the premise that Kiev's non-accession to NATO, as well as reaffirming its neutral, non-aligned status as per the 1990 Declaration on Ukraine's state sovereignty, in which it obviously said it would be a neutral power and it would not, it wouldn't join any armed alliances and would not possess nuclear weapons. This was all in its 1990 Declaration of State Sovereignty, so at the time when the Soviet Union was still in existence. These factors form one of the two pillars for a final settlement in Ukraine. In the Ukraine crisis, that would meet Russia's security interests. The second pillar consists of overcoming the legacy of the neo-Nazi regime, which took power in Kiev after February 2014 putsch, including the initiative by its perpetrators to eradicate and cancel, in both physical and legislative terms, everything Russian, be it the Russian language, media, culture, traditions, and the canonical Orthodox faith. This is the point at which Margaret Beckett talked about, it's not illegal to speak Russian. And then he says, the international recognition of Crimea, Sevastopol, the DPR, LPR, the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions as part of Russia is another imperative. Now, this seems to me quite stark in saying the international recognition of Crimea, Sevastopol, the DPR, LPR, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions as part of Russia is another imperative. Now, what we've been talking about, or at least from the various dribs and drabs that we've been able to elicit, that Trump is willing to recognize unilaterally the incorporation of Crimea within the Russian Federation. The United States isn't asking anyone else to do so. Certainly not asking Ukraine to do so, not asking the European to do so. Whereas the DPR, LPR, Kherson, and Zaporozhye regions, then it would be de facto recognition of the territory under Russian occupation, but under Russian occupation, not incorporated within the Russian Federation, but only as far as the territory that is under Russian occupation. In other words, up to the line of control. Those parts of those regions, which are about 30%, that are still under Ukrainian control, they would just remain under Ukrainian control. But here, Lavrov is speaking of international recognition, which is, that's much, that goes way beyond anything that Trump is talking about. And he seems to be talking about the entirety of the Donetsk, Lugansk, and Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. So in their entirety, not up until the line of control. And then he says, all the commitments Kiev assumes must be legally binding, contain enforcement mechanisms, and be permanent. Demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine is also on the agenda, along with lifting sanctions, withdrawing lawsuits, and canceling arrest warrants, as well as returning Russian assets subjected to the so-called freeze in the West. So that's quite a shopping list that Lavrov presents. Demilitarizing and denazifying, which means regime change in Kiev, lifting sanctions. So Trump did promise, at least from what we're hearing as to in this peace plan, to lift sanctions, but only the American sanctions on Russia. Withdrawing the lawsuits that hasn't come up yet, and canceling the arrest warrants. That certainly hasn't. I mean, it's understandable, but hasn't yet been discussed. As well as returning Russian assets, which obviously would be those sovereign assets, the 300 billion euros of sovereign assets that basically was seized by the Europeans. And then we will also insist on obtaining solid security guarantees for the Russian Federation in order to shield it from any threats emanating from hostile activities by NATO and the European Union and some of their member states along our western border. So that sounds like, and the, we want to get those two draft agreements that Putin submitted to the United States and to NATO in December 2021. We want those negotiated, agreed upon, and signed and ratified as part of any deal. So this is quite a shopping list on the part of Lavrov, and certainly goes far beyond anything that had been said by by any of the Russian leaders in the recent past. By recent past, I mean since Trump came to power, and that makes it quite interesting because we have been cautiously optimistic that if you remember June 2024, when Putin spelled out his conditions essentially for a ceasefire, that Russia will stop firing if Ukraine withdraws from the four oblasts, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and just basically unilaterally withdraws, and at that moment, Russia will stop the war. In other words, to withdraw from all of the territories that it occupies within those four oblasts. That was what Putin said this in June 2024. But recently, he hadn't really talked about that. He talked about the root causes of that needs to be addressed, but he hadn't gone back to the quite serious demands that he had made in June 2024. Here Lavrov is going back to that, and then some, even more. He goes even beyond what Putin declared at that time. So that tends to make me feel pessimistic that we're anywhere close to any kind of a deal. And my pessimism is reinforced by an article in the New York Times about the state of the negotiations, where that does look like they seem to be a long way from any kind of a deal. Here's this article. It says Ukraine peace plan hints at concessions, but major obstacles remain. Officials in Kiev plan to deliver their proposal to President Trump's team after rejecting a White House plan that would have given the Kremlin much of what it wants. Well, it wouldn't have given the Kremlin much of what it gave. The Kremlin would have made very substantial concessions, but that's, in New York Times' eyes, yeah, it gives the Kremlin much of what it wants. But then here it says, in response to a White House proposal to end the war in Ukraine, that critics say would grant the Kremlin much of what it wants, Ukraine's leadership has drafted a counteroffer, one that in some ways contradicts what President Trump has demanded, but also leaves room for possible compromises on issues that have long seemed intractable. And then under the plan obtained by the New York Times, there would be no restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian military. A European security contingent backed by the United States would be deployed on the Ukrainian territory to guarantee security, and frozen Russian assets would be used to repair damage in Ukraine caused during the war. So that's pretty much as spelled out in that counter plan, which we'd covered in previous podcasts. So we had the alleged Trump-Witkoff plan, and then the counter plan, which is presented by Ukraine and its European enablers, which is the European security contingent backed by the United States, which is the American backstop, as Keir Starmer would put it. It would be deployed on Ukrainian territory, and effectively it would be a kind of Article 5 security guarantee. So NATO, Ukraine would be effectively in NATO, NATO by any other name. Obviously a non-starter. And the New York Times knows that it's a non-starter. And the frozen Russian assets would be used to repair damage in Ukraine caused during the war. Also a non-starter. Russia's not going to sign off to what would be outright theft of its assets. And there's really no reason for it to do so because, of course, the Europeans have very limited legal claims that are likely to be held up by the courts. I mean, it's basically Russia's assets. You can't just simply seize a country's assets because you don't like that country and you don't like its policies. I mean, it's just the courts are not going to accept that. And anyway, it says those three provisions could be non-starters for the Kremlin. Yes, they could indeed. But parts of the Ukrainian plan suggest a search for a compromise. There is no mention, for instance, of Ukraine fully regaining all the territory seized by Russia or an insistence on Ukraine joining NATO. Of course, the Ukraine joining NATO is meaningless if you've put in effectively an Article 5 security guarantees by bringing in essentially European and American forces into Ukraine. So that, and then it says that Ukraine's latest proposal makes no demand, for instance, that Ukraine's membership in NATO be guaranteed, though this has long been a position held by Zelensky. Instead, it says Ukraine's accession to NATO depends on consensus among alliances members. Again, they're playing the semantic game, thinking that we won't notice that you're pretty much saying Ukraine will be a member of NATO, a de facto member of NATO. Once you put in European and American forces and accompanied by an Article 5 guarantee, which is the only reason why you would want to put in European and American forces, why else would you want them? Then it's a member of NATO. In talks in London and Paris, American officials reiterated Mr. Trump's intention to oppose NATO membership in Europe, but they told their Ukrainian counterparts that this position would not bind future American presidents if any have a different stance. Now, to read this again, this is just amazing, isn't it? American officials reiterated Mr. Trump's intention to oppose NATO membership for Ukraine, but they told their Ukrainian counterparts that this position would not bind future American presidents if any have a different stance. So even that, as I said, the whole NATO membership is completely irrelevant if you're putting in American forces into Ukraine. But they're saying, well, you know, this is just simply Trump. Trump is saying he's not going to sign off on Ukraine membership of NATO. But yeah, Trump can't bind his successor. His successor could easily change his mind. So in fact, Russia gets nothing. I mean, even the minimum that you might have got, well, okay, well, at least Ukraine isn't a member of, it's not going to be formally a member of NATO. It doesn't even get that. Well, until Trump is gone, and then the next man in will make Ukraine a member of NATO. Now, this is obviously, I mean, there's no way Russians are going to accept something where they don't get anything at all, even the minimum of some kind of a pretense of a binding commitment. There's no binding commitment at all there. It's just like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal. Well, okay, you sign it. Next man in says, well, I'm going to unsign it. So yeah, yeah, I know President Trump said Ukraine isn't going to be NATO, but hey, he can't bind me, so I'm going to get Ukraine into NATO. Now you can see why the Russians are rather frustrated and say, no, we want things to be absolutely copper bottom. You know that no ands, ifs, and buts. Otherwise, you are going to pull this kind of a stunt on us. And the White House has taken Ukraine's side, not Russia, when it comes to the future shape of Ukraine's military. The Kremlin has demanded that Ukraine's military, now the largest and most battle-hardened in Europe, besides Russia's own, be subject to strict limitations on its size and capabilities. Trump administration officials have told the Ukrainians that they would not support such limitations. So can you imagine this? So this is, again, the minimum that Russia would expect. This is what Russia was negotiating at the time of the Istanbul talks, and Ukraine had agreed to that. You had agreed on strict limitations on Ukraine's military. And now, according to the Times story, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, obviously, because it's the New York Times. It's saying that that the Trump administration have told the Ukrainians they would not support limitations on the size of Ukraine's armed forces. So, yeah, you get some kind of an agreement, a ceasefire or an agreement or whatever, and then the Europeans and the Americans, because the Americans, since the Americans aren't even signing on, the Americans are obviously going to do it. The Europeans and the Americans start pouring in weaponry into Ukraine, training Ukrainians for the next round, a next round which could well take place when Ukraine is a member of NATO. So there's no limitation on Ukraine joining NATO, no limitation of Ukraine's armed forces. I don't think we're close to a deal here. And then it says, Trump administration officials have described as unrealistic Mr. Zelensky's goal of pushing Russian forces out of all of the occupied territories. Yeah, at the moment. But if you do all those other things, build up its armed forces, get it into NATO, whether by the back door initially and the front door after Trump's gone, then 5-10 years time, Ukraine under Western auspices can try to retake the occupied territories. The American proposal would accept a de facto Russian control over those occupied areas, again, for the time being, which makes it hardly in any way an acceptable deal for Russia. She said, well, you promise that you'll behave yourself for 6 months, maybe less. Ukraine and its European partners say that would amount to rewarding Russian aggression. Of course they would. And then it says, while this would be a painful concession for the Ukrainians, the Trump administration has so far refused to acquiesce to all of Russia's territorial demands. The White House, for instance, has declined to go along with a Russian demand that Ukraine retreat from the entirety of the 4 Ukrainian provinces Mr. Putin has declared part of Russia. One participant in the talk said the White House position was that this was an unreasonable and unachievable demand that the United States would not support. Now, to be honest, I think that's not an unreasonable position for the United States to take if we're going to try and negotiate some kind of an agreement, because if Russia hasn't taken those 30% of Donetsk, the 30% of Kherson, 30% of Zaporozhye, and it hasn't taken them, then why should the United States enable Russia? Why should the United States demand that Ukraine withdraw from its territory and let Russia take over? If Russia wasn't able to do it by its force of arms, why should the United States have to do this for Russia? So that's a reasonable position for the United States to take. However, it's not something that I think the Russians are going to agree to. I mean, as we saw from the statement from Lavrov about these oblasts are part of the Russian Federation, the entirety clearly meant the entirety. And then going back to Putin's statement of June 2024, well, again, Ukraine has to withdraw from all of the 4 oblasts. So when you look at these interviews, and then you look at the story from the Times, which is something based on the Trump negotiating team, it doesn't look like there's anything, any prospects of a deal are likely, because I think they're really very far apart, and it's clear that the Trump team, or members of the Trump team that talk to the New York Times, have very little inclination in meeting Russia's demands. So the war goes on, and then the question arises, or obviously we can't talk about this now. What does the Trump administration do? Whom does it blame? Does it blame Russia for the failure of its good intentions of trying to bring this war to an end, or does it blame Ukraine? If it blames Russia, then I think the United States escalates its involvement, escalates its support for Ukraine, and therefore, the war, I think, will intensify. If it blames Ukraine, then will Trump walk away, as Marco Rubio has threatened to do, and as Trump himself has sort of threatened to? He hasn't quite done it, but he has sort of threatened to. Well, we'll have to see. But certainly the signs are not good that we're close to any kind of a deal. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon.